From the moment humanity learned to measure time, we assumed it moved forward in a straight and obedient line, flowing from past to present to future, like a calm river that could be charted and predicted, yet history itself has always whispered a different truth, one of fractures and loops and invisible currents pulling events into strange alignments beyond our comprehension. And it was this quiet suspicion that first took root in my mind decades ago, long before the date that would come to define everything, long before the absence that would echo louder than any presence ever could. Because I had spent a lifetime studying the delicate thread of lineage that stretched from myself into a future so distant it bordered on myth, tracing generations yet unborn, imagining faces that science said would one day exist, trusting in the inevitability of cause and effect, until that trust was shattered by a single inexplicable void, the disappearance of my 20th great-granddaughter, a child who, according to every calculation, every model of temporal continuity, every projection of genetic succession, should have arrived on January 25th of the year 2026, crossing from the year 3906 into our present reality as part of an experimental temporal observation program that had been whispered about in scientific circles but never fully revealed to the public. A program designed to test the stability of time by allowing brief crossings of individuals from distant futures into controlled moments of the past. And yet when the appointed hour came and went, when the instruments hummed and the energy fields pulsed exactly as they always had before, there was nothing. No flash of arrival, no ripple in space-time, no frightened child stepping forward from centuries ahead, only silence. A silence so complete it felt as though the universe itself had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. At first, the official explanation was simple: a malfunction, a calibration error, a minor distortion in the temporal coordinates that had caused the transfer to abort before completion. But those of us who understood the technology knew better, because time travel at that stage of development was no longer a fragile experiment, prone to such trivial failures. It had become as precise as satellite navigation, as dependable as atomic clocks, with redundancy systems layered upon redundancy systems to prevent exactly this kind of outcome. And besides, this was not the first crossing that had been attempted. Dozens had succeeded before. Individuals from centuries ahead stepping briefly into our present, observed, documented, and safely returned to their own era, each arrival confirming that the timeline remained stable, that the future remained intact, that what we were moving toward still existed. And so when my 20th great-granddaughter failed to appear, it was not merely a technical issue. It was an anomaly, one that sent quiet shock waves through every department involved in temporal research. Her name, recorded in future archives, was Elara, a child born into a world of floating cities and reconstructed ecosystems, of artificial suns orbiting distant colonies, of humanity spread across star systems, yet still bound by the same genetic threads that tied her back to me. And I had seen her image, preserved in future records as part of lineage documentation, a girl with dark eyes and a curious expression, her face carrying echoes of ancestors long gone, including my own, and knowing that she existed, that she would exist, had always given me a strange comfort, a sense that the chain of human continuity would endure no matter what crises the present faced, until suddenly that certainty was ripped away, replaced by a terrifying question that no one wanted to voice aloud. What if she did not arrive because she could not arrive? What if the future she came from no longer existed? Time, as physicists eventually admitted, was not a single immutable line, but a vast branching structure of probabilities, constantly splitting into new realities with every choice made, every event altered, forming what some called the multiverse and others simply referred to as the temporal web. And the technology that allowed brief crossings did not travel along one fixed timeline, but rather locked onto specific probability branches where the desired individual existed, pulling them momentarily across the dimensional boundary into our own branch, a process so complex that even the engineers who built the machines could only partially explain it. Relying heavily on self-correcting algorithms derived from future knowledge, Yet despite this complexity, the system had always found its target before, which made Alara's absence all the more disturbing, because it implied that when the machine reached out into the temporal web to locate her branch, it found nothing, no signal, no matching coordinates, no living future in which she could be found, as if that entire branch had collapsed or been erased. The official narrative, carefully worded and delivered to avoid public panic, suggested that Alara's timeline had diverged too far from ours to be accessible, that a minor historical variation had altered the course of her existence just enough to prevent synchronization. But privately, among researchers, the conversations were far darker, filled with whispered theories of temporal annihilation, of cascading paradoxes that could wipe out entire future branches like dominoes falling through centuries, of catastrophic events so immense they did not merely kill populations, but severed the very continuation of human lineage beyond a certain point. And every one of those theories pointed toward the same chilling possibility that something in the future around the year 3906 had gone terribly wrong. I remember standing in the observation chamber long after the scheduled arrival time had passed, staring at the empty platform where Alara should have appeared, the faint glow of residual energy slowly fading from the air, feeling a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with personal loss and everything to do with existential dread, because if one future child could vanish without explanation, then the future itself was no longer guaranteed. It was no longer a fixed destination we were steadily approaching, but a fragile construct that could be altered, erased, or replaced without warning. And the implications of that realization stretched far beyond my own family, touching every human alive. As investigations began, data streams were pored over with obsessive precision, every nanosecond of the failed transfer analyzed, every fluctuation in the temporal field mapped and compared to previous successful crossings. And what emerged was not evidence of malfunction, but rather of absence, a void where a stable future signal should have been, much like attempting to tune into a radio frequency that no longer existed. The machine had reached out exactly as programmed, but instead of locking onto Alara's timeline, it encountered a chaotic interference pattern, a kind of temporal static that suggested massive instability beyond a certain point in the future, a storm of disrupted probability branches collapsing into one another. Some scientists likened it to observing the aftermath of a supernova in space-time, where once there had been structured order, now there was only turbulence, while others compared it to a digital file corrupted beyond recovery, fragments still detectable, but no longer forming a coherent whole. And the more they examined the data, the clearer it became that this was not a localized event affecting only Alara's branch, but something far larger, a phenomenon that seemed to originate around the late 39th century and ripple outward across countless potential futures. Theories multiplied rapidly, ranging from catastrophic climate collapse to interstellar war, from runaway artificial intelligence to experimental physics disasters involving energy scales beyond our current comprehension, each hypothesis more terrifying than the last. Yet all shared one common thread, that humanity's long-term survival past a certain era was no longer assured, and in many scenarios not merely threatened, but outright extinguished. What troubled me most was not just the possibility of extinction, but the idea of erasure, because extinction implied death within time, whereas erasure suggested something far more profound, the removal of entire segments of reality from the temporal structure itself, as if the universe had edited out a portion of its own story. And if that were true, then Alara had not simply died in her future, she had never existed at all beyond a certain probabilistic threshold, her life reduced to a ghostly echo preserved only in historical projections and lineage simulations. This concept of temporal echoes soon became central to the investigation, referring to individuals whose existence was once probable enough to be recorded in future models, but whose timelines had since collapsed, leaving behind only informational remnants, much like fossils of species long extinct, and Alara, it seemed, was not alone, as deeper scans revealed inconsistencies in projections involving numerous future individuals. entire genealogical trees ending abruptly where once they had extended centuries further, suggesting that whatever event had occurred in the far future was not selective, but widespread, reshaping the very boundaries of human continuity. Public disclosure of these findings was slow and heavily filtered, with authorities choosing to frame the situation as a scientific mystery rather than an existential crisis. But leaks inevitably emerged, spreading across networks and igniting global anxiety. As people grappled with the unsettling notion that the future might already be damaged, that choices made long before their birth could have set humanity on a path toward a dead end, and that the comforting assumption of progress stretching endlessly forward was perhaps nothing more than an illusion. Religious groups interpreted the anomaly as a sign of impending apocalypse. Philosophers debated whether a future that no longer existed could still influence the present, and everyday citizens wondered if their own descendants would one day vanish from probability, just as Ilara had, leaving behind only faint traces in theoretical models. While through it all, I remained fixated on that empty platform, the place where my 20th great-granddaughter should have stood, a symbol of everything we thought we knew about time now thrown into doubt. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded beyond temporal physics into historical analysis, attempting to identify pivotal moments between our present and the year 3906 that could have triggered such a massive collapse of futures, mapping out critical technological developments, environmental tipping points, socio-political transitions, and experimental breakthroughs that carried both promise and peril, essentially creating a timeline of potential existential risks. And what emerged was not a single obvious culprit, but a convergence of vulnerabilities, a series of compounding threats that, if mishandled, could easily spiral into catastrophe. Among the most concerning was humanity's increasing reliance on autonomous systems, particularly self-evolving artificial intelligences designed to manage planetary infrastructure, climate regulation, and interstellar navigation, systems so complex they would one day surpass human comprehension, raising the possibility that a minor error or misaligned objective could escalate uncontrollably across centuries. Another was the manipulation of space-time itself through high-energy experiments aimed at harvesting vacuum energy or creating stable wormholes, endeavors that promised limitless power and instantaneous travel but carried unknown risks to the fabric of reality. And then there were the environmental challenges, the long-term effects of climate engineering projects intended to reverse global warming, but potentially destabilizing ecosystems in unforeseen ways. Each of these developments alone posed significant danger, but together they formed a web of interconnected risks, where failure in one domain could trigger cascading effects across others, painting a picture of a future balanced precariously on the edge of technological triumph and self-destruction. And it was within this context that Ilara's disappearance took on its full significance, not as an isolated mystery, but as a warning signal, a glimpse into a future that might already be unraveling. Some researchers began to argue that the anomaly was not merely observational, but causal, suggesting that the very act of peering into the future and interacting with it through temporal crossings could destabilize probability branches, creating feedback loops that amplified small changes into massive disruptions, essentially implying that our attempts to study and manipulate time might have contributed to the collapse we were now witnessing evidence of, a theory that sparked intense ethical debates about whether humanity should continue temporal research at all. Others countered that the collapse was likely inevitable regardless of our interference, driven by the natural trajectory of technological advancement and environmental stress, and that temporal observation was simply revealing what was already set in motion, but regardless of the cause, the reality remained that a future once considered probable enough to send individuals back from no longer appeared stable, and my missing great-granddaughter stood as the most personal and haunting symbol of that instability. In quieter moments, I found myself wondering about Ilara as a person. not just as a data point in a temporal anomaly, imagining the life she might have lived in her advanced world, the experiences she would have had, the knowledge she would have carried, and the fact that she had likely been aware of the crossing, prepared to meet an ancestor separated from her by nearly 2 millennia, only to have that meeting erased by forces beyond either of our control, and whether in some fractured remnant of a timeline she still existed, perhaps living out her life, unaware that in countless other branches she had vanished before ever stepping into the present. This notion of fragmented existence, of lives unfolding in some realities while disappearing in others, added another layer of existential unease, challenging the idea of individuality itself, because if a person could exist in one branch and not in another, what did that say about the permanence of identity? And were we ourselves merely one version among countless alternatives, some thriving, some destroyed, some never coming into being at all? The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that Ilara's disappearance was not a simple glitch, but a symptom of something far more profound, a disturbance in the architecture of time that hinted at a future radically different from the one humanity had long envisioned, a future that might be shorter, darker, or fundamentally altered in ways we could scarcely imagine. And as researchers continued to unravel fragments of data pointing toward instability beyond the 39th century, a chilling consensus began to form that unless significant changes were made in the present, the probability of humanity's long-term survival was far lower than previously believed. Yet amidst the fear and uncertainty, there was also a strange sense of opportunity, because if the future was not fixed, if entire branches could collapse or be reshaped, then perhaps new, more hopeful paths could also be created. Timelines where humanity learned from its mistakes, balanced technological progress with ethical restraint, and avoided the catastrophic outcomes now looming in probability models. And in that sense, Ilara's absence, painful as it was, might serve as a catalyst for transformation, a wake-up call, forcing civilization to confront its vulnerabilities before it was too late. Still, the haunting question remained unanswered. What exactly had happened around the year 3906? What event or sequence of events had destabilized the future so thoroughly that individuals like my great-granddaughter could no longer be reached, and whether that future was truly gone or merely shifted beyond our current ability to observe, existing somewhere in the vast multiverse as a faint, unreachable echo? As the months passed and the shock of Ilara's absence settled into a heavy permanence, the research shifted from frantic analysis to something more methodical and far-reaching, no longer focused solely on why one child had failed to arrive, but on what her disappearance revealed about the deeper mechanics of time itself. Because the more scientists probed the chaotic interference patterns detected during the failed transfer, the more they began to resemble not random noise but structured disruptions, like waves overlapping and cancelling one another in complex rhythms, suggesting that multiple probability branches were converging and collapsing simultaneously, creating zones of temporal instability that could no longer support coherent futures beyond certain thresholds. And this phenomenon, which soon came to be informally called temporal convergence collapse, implied that rather than a single catastrophic event erasing the future, it might be the cumulative weight of countless smaller divergences accumulating over centuries until the temporal web itself could no longer sustain the growing complexity. This idea was rooted in the concept that every decision humanity made, every technological leap, every environmental intervention, every conflict resolved or escalated, added new layers of branching probabilities. And while the universe could accommodate a vast number of such branches, it might not be infinite in its capacity to maintain stability, much like a structure that can support only so much additional weight before stress fractures begin to form. And once those fractures spread far enough, entire sections could collapse, wiping out all futures dependent on them. Which meant that the disappearance of Ilara might not be due to a specific disaster in her era, but to a long chain of compounding choices stretching all the way back to our present, each contributing a small amount of strain until the system finally gave way. If this were true, then humanity had not simply stumbled into a doomed future, but had gradually constructed it through centuries of incremental actions, many of them well-intentioned, each one barely noticeable on its own, yet collectively pushing the temporal structure toward failure. A realization that reframed responsibility in a sobering way, because it suggested that even seemingly minor decisions today could echo forward across millennia, influencing not just societal outcomes, but the very existence of future generations. To test this theory, researchers began running massive simulations, feeding historical data into quantum probability engines capable of modeling countless potential futures branching from key moments in human history, tracking how different choices altered the long-term stability of the temporal web. And what emerged from these simulations was both fascinating and terrifying, as certain paths led to flourishing civilizations, extending tens of thousands of years into the future with stable timelines, while others showed increasing turbulence beyond a few millennia, with probability branches becoming so densely packed and chaotic that collapse became almost inevitable. Strikingly, many of the unstable futures shared common features: rapid technological acceleration, without corresponding ethical frameworks, heavy reliance on automated systems to manage essential planetary functions, aggressive exploitation of cosmic resources, and repeated attempts to manipulate fundamental forces of nature for energy and transportation, all trends already visible in our present trajectory, while the more stable futures tended to emphasize slower, more deliberate progress, decentralized control systems, strong environmental stewardship, and strict limitations on high-risk scientific experimentation, painting a clear picture of how humanity's long-term survival might hinge not on innovation alone, but on restraint. These findings, though still theoretical, added a new layer of urgency to the mystery of Ilara's disappearance, because they suggested that the future collapse hinted at by her absence was not predetermined, but probabilistic, a path humanity was drifting toward rather than locked into. And that, with enough awareness and collective action, it might still be possible to steer civilization toward a more stable set of futures. However, there was a darker implication as well, because if temporal convergence collapse was already underway around the year 3906 in many probability branches, it meant that humanity might have a limited window to course correct before instability became unavoidable, and that Ilara's vanished timeline could represent a warning from one of the many futures where that window had already closed. As these ideas circulated within scientific communities, they sparked intense debates not only about the nature of time, but about free will itself. Because if the future could be reshaped by present actions, then humanity was not merely a passenger moving along a predetermined track, but an active participant in constructing reality's long-term structure. Yet the presence of collapsed futures suggested that some paths led to irreversible outcomes, raising the question of whether there existed points of no return beyond which even the most drastic changes could not restore stability. This philosophical tension became deeply personal for me, as I grappled with the possibility that my great-granddaughter's non-existence might be the result of humanity crossing such a threshold in her timeline, a point after which the accumulation of risk and instability could no longer be undone, and while that future might still exist in faint, unreachable branches of the multiverse, it was effectively lost to us, sealed off by the chaotic interference that now blocked temporal access. Meanwhile, other researchers pursued a different line of inquiry, exploring the possibility that Ilara's disappearance was not due to collapse but displacement, that rather than being erased, her timeline had shifted into a region of the multiverse no longer aligned with our own, like a radio station drifting out of frequency range, and according to this theory, massive cosmic events, such as collisions between parallel universes, or large-scale space-time distortions caused by advanced technologies, could gradually alter the relative positions of probability branches, making some futures increasingly difficult or impossible to reach through temporal crossings. If this were the case, then Ilara and countless others from her era might still exist, living out their lives in a future that had simply moved beyond our observational horizon. A comforting thought on the surface, yet equally unsettling, because it implied that reality was far more fragmented than we had ever imagined, with entire civilizations drifting away from one another across the vast landscape of the multiverse, unable to interact or even detect each other's existence. Evidence for this displacement hypothesis came from subtle anomalies detected in background spacetime measurements, faint oscillations in quantum fields that some physicists interpreted as signatures of large-scale dimensional shifts, though these readings were highly contested and could just as easily be explained by experimental noise or unknown natural phenomena. But the possibility nonetheless captured public imagination when leaked reports began circulating, inspiring everything from hopeful narratives about lost futures still thriving somewhere beyond reach to darker conspiracies suggesting that powerful entities might be intentionally manipulating timelines for their own purposes. The media frenzy that followed only complicated matters, as sensational headlines alternated between declaring the future destroyed and proclaiming it merely hidden, while conspiracy theories flourished, ranging from secret temporal wars being fought between advanced civilizations to covert government experiments accidentally tearing holes in reality. And through it all, the core mystery remained unresolved. Ilara had not arrived, and no amount of speculation could change that simple, haunting fact. In private, I continued to work closely with a small group of researchers who were attempting something unprecedented, a deep temporal probe designed not to pull an individual from the future, but to send observational signals forward along multiple probability branches, essentially acting as a kind of temporal sonar, mapping the structure of future timelines by detecting reflections from stable and unstable regions, a process far more energy-intensive and risky than standard crossings, but one that could potentially reveal whether the future beyond the 39th century still existed in any coherent form. The first results were both illuminating and deeply disturbing, as the probes detected strong, stable reflections from futures up to around the mid-36th century, indicating well-defined probability branches extending that far. But beyond that point, the signals became increasingly scattered and weak, as if the temporal landscape grew more turbulent, and past approximately the late 39th century, reflections dropped off sharply, replaced by chaotic noise patterns, remarkably similar to those observed during Ilara's failed transfer, suggesting that while some stable futures might still exist beyond that horizon, they were far fewer and far harder to access. This pattern lent weight to the idea that humanity's long-term future was undergoing a kind of narrowing, where many once probable timelines were collapsing or drifting away, leaving only a handful of viable paths forward, and the fact that Ilara's era lay precisely within this turbulent zone made her disappearance feel less like an isolated incident and more like a symptom of a larger transitional phase in the temporal structure. What frightened many researchers was not just the reduction in stable futures, but the acceleration of this process in simulation models, as when historical data was extended forward under current trends, the onset of instability appeared to creep closer to the present, suggesting that the window of relative temporal stability might be shrinking faster than previously thought. A sobering implication that humanity's actions in the coming centuries could determine whether future generations like Ilara would exist at all. These findings, though still preliminary, forced a reckoning within the scientific community about the ethical implications of temporal research itself. Because if observing or interacting with the future could influence probability structures, even in subtle ways, then continued experimentation might inadvertently worsen instability, creating a feedback loop where attempts to understand time accelerated its breakdown. And some called for an immediate moratorium on all temporal crossings and probes, arguing that humanity was playing with forces far beyond its ability to control. Others argued just as passionately that withdrawing from research would be even more dangerous, leaving humanity blind to looming existential threats and unable to adjust its course in time, and that understanding the mechanics of temporal instability was the only way to prevent catastrophic outcomes, framing the situation as a race against time itself, where knowledge was both the risk and the potential salvation. Caught between these opposing views, global leaders convened unprecedented summits bringing together scientists, philosophers, ethicists, and policymakers to debate the future of temporal research and humanity's long-term trajectory, discussions that often stretched for days without resolution, as participants struggled to balance the desire for progress with the need for caution, and all the while, the shadow of the missing future loomed over every conversation. For me, these debates were inseparable from the image of Ilara's empty arrival platform, because behind every abstract theory and simulation lay the reality of a child who should have existed, who in countless stable futures might have lived a full life, contributed to her society, perhaps even stood as a symbol of humanity's endurance. Yet in our observed timeline, she had become a ghost of probability, a reminder of what might be lost if civilization failed to navigate the delicate balance between innovation and restraint. In moments of exhaustion, I sometimes wondered whether humanity was truly capable of making the collective changes necessary to steer toward a stable future. Given our long history of short-term thinking and internal conflict, and whether Ilara's disappearance was not just a warning, but an inevitability, a glimpse of a fate we were slowly but steadily approaching regardless of our efforts. Yet in other moments, the very existence of multiple potential futures filled me with cautious hope, because it meant that no outcome was entirely fixed, that even a path trending toward collapse could, in theory, be redirected. As the investigation continued, and the data grew more complex, one thing became increasingly clear. The mystery of Ilara's absence was not merely about one missing individual or one failed experiment, but about the fundamental nature of time, choice, and humanity's responsibility for shaping the long-term structure of reality, and whether the future would remain a vast open landscape of possibility, or shrink into a narrow corridor leading toward oblivion. As the weight of these discoveries settled over the scientific community and the world at large, a subtle shift occurred in how people perceived not just the future but the present, because time was no longer seen as a distant horizon gradually approaching, but as a living structure being shaped in real time by every decision made. And this awareness began to influence everything from government policy to individual behavior, as initiatives focused on long-term sustainability gained unprecedented momentum, while high-risk technological ventures faced increasing scrutiny. Yet despite these changes, the temporal data continued to suggest that instability was already deeply embedded in many probability branches, implying that even with immediate reforms, the effects of centuries of compounded actions could not be undone overnight. One of the most profound consequences of the ongoing research was the emergence of what came to be known as temporal responsibility theory, a philosophical framework arguing that humanity bore ethical obligations not only to current generations, but to future ones whose existence depended on the stability of the temporal web, reframing moral decision-making to account for impacts across millennia. And while this concept resonated with many, it also faced resistance from those who believed it placed unrealistic burdens on the present, forcing societies to sacrifice immediate benefits for abstract future outcomes that might never materialize. This tension played out in political arenas worldwide, as leaders debated whether to halt major technological projects that promised economic growth but carried long-term risks, such as deep space-time energy extraction facilities and self-governing AI infrastructure systems. And although some nations adopted precautionary approaches, others continued full speed ahead, driven by competition and the fear of falling behind, inadvertently creating further divergence among probability branches, which researchers noted with concern in their simulations, as uneven global responses tended to increase temporal turbulence rather than reduce it. At the same time, The public's fascination with Ilara's disappearance evolved into something almost mythic, her name becoming shorthand for the lost future, appearing in literature, art, and digital media as a symbol of fragility and hope intertwined. And while many people expressed grief for a child they had never met, others used her story as a rallying cry for change, advocating for policies aimed at safeguarding humanity's long-term survival. Yet there were also those who dismissed the entire phenomenon as exaggerated or misinterpreted science, clinging to the belief that the future would naturally resolve itself as it always had. Amid this cultural upheaval, the deep temporal probes continued to refine their mapping of future probability landscapes, gradually revealing patterns that suggested not just collapse or displacement, but the presence of what some researchers called temporal scars, regions of space-time where past disturbances had permanently altered the structure of probability, much like geological faults left behind after massive earthquakes. And these scars appeared to correspond to moments of intense technological experimentation or large-scale cosmic events in certain future timelines, hinting that humanity's manipulation of fundamental forces might leave lasting imprints on reality itself. One particularly striking discovery was a cluster of temporal scars centered around the late 38th and early 39th centuries, precisely the period leading up to Ilara's era. And although the probes could not directly observe the events that caused these disruptions, the energy signatures suggested phenomena far beyond natural cosmic occurrences, pointing instead toward artificial origins, possibly linked to advanced physics experiments involving space-time manipulation, and this raised the chilling possibility that in some futures, humanity's quest to harness and control the universe's deepest mechanisms had triggered irreversible damage to the temporal structure. Speculation intensified around a hypothetical project referred to in fragmented future records as the Continuum Initiative, an ambitious endeavor rumored to aim at creating stable, controllable wormhole networks for instantaneous travel and energy transmission across vast distances, effectively turning space-time itself into a resource. And while the details were sparse and often contradictory, many researchers suspected that attempts to stabilize such structures could have produced massive temporal distortions, especially if something went wrong, potentially causing cascading failures across probability branches. If the Continuum Initiative or a similar project had indeed existed in Ilara's future, it might explain the convergence collapse patterns detected in the probes, as large-scale space-time manipulation could theoretically weaken the boundaries between branches, causing them to interfere with and destabilize one another, much like overlapping waves creating chaotic turbulence. And in this scenario, Ilara's disappearance would not be due to extinction or displacement alone, but to the fundamental breakdown of the temporal architecture supporting her timeline. This hypothesis, though still speculative, gained traction as more anomalies were correlated with predicted timelines of advanced space-time engineering in simulation models. And while no definitive proof could be obtained due to the inability to directly observe those distant futures, the consistency of these patterns made it increasingly difficult to ignore the potential risks inherent in manipulating the fabric of reality itself. The ethical implications of this possibility were staggering because it suggested that humanity's pursuit of progress might eventually reach a point where it not only endangered civilizations, but threatened the continuity of time, raising questions about whether certain technological frontiers should remain forever out of reach, regardless of the potential benefits, and whether there existed natural limits imposed by the universe to prevent intelligent species from unraveling the very structures that made existence possible. For me, these revelations deepened the sense of both loss and responsibility tied to Ilara's absence, because if her timeline had been destabilized by humanity's own future actions, then her disappearance was not merely a tragic accident, but the consequence of choices made by generations descended from us. A sobering reminder that progress without foresight could carry unimaginable costs, and that every step forward carried the potential to shape or shatter the future. As months turned into years, the investigation reached a turning point with the development of a new form of temporal resonance imaging, a technology capable of detecting faint probability echoes from collapsed or inaccessible timelines, essentially allowing researchers to glimpse remnants of futures that no longer existed in stable form. And when this system was applied to the region of the temporal web corresponding to Elara's era, the results were haunting, revealing fragmented impressions of advanced cities, vast orbital structures, and ecosystems restored through centuries of careful engineering, all flickering like broken holograms before dissolving into static, suggesting that her future had once been vibrant and complex before suffering catastrophic destabilization. These echoes were not clear enough to reconstruct specific events, but provided compelling evidence that Elara's timeline had not simply failed to form, but had existed and then been damaged or erased, lending strong support to the collapse hypothesis over the displacement theory, and the emotional impact of witnessing these ghostly remnants was profound. As researchers found themselves mourning entire civilizations that might have thrived for centuries only to vanish beyond recovery. In the public eye, these revelations shifted the narrative from uncertainty to a growing acceptance that some version of the future had indeed been lost, and with it countless lives that would never be lived, sparking widespread existential reflection about the fragility of human destiny, while simultaneously intensifying calls for radical changes in how humanity approached technological advancement, environmental stewardship, and global cooperation. Yet even as the sense of urgency grew, so did the realization that humanity was far from unified in its response, as geopolitical tensions, economic pressures, and ideological divides continued to shape decisions, sometimes in direct opposition to the recommendations of scientists advocating for long-term stability, creating a complex and often frustrating landscape where progress toward a safer future was uneven and uncertain. Within this context, a small but growing movement emerged, advocating for what they called temporal preservation, a comprehensive approach to safeguarding the future that combines strict regulations on high-risk technologies, aggressive environmental restoration, global conflict reduction initiatives, and ethical oversight of advanced scientific research. And while initially dismissed by some as overly idealistic, the movement gradually gained influence as more data underscored the precariousness of humanity's long-term trajectory. I found myself increasingly aligned with these efforts, not just as a researcher, but as someone personally touched by the consequences of temporal instability, using my experiences and the story of Elara's disappearance to illustrate the tangible human cost of abstract future risks. And although it was often emotionally exhausting to revisit that absence, it also felt necessary, a way of ensuring that her lost timeline was not forgotten or dismissed as mere scientific anomaly. Despite these efforts, the fundamental mystery of what precisely triggered the collapse around the year 3906 remained unresolved, with multiple contributing factors likely intertwined, from advanced space-time engineering to systemic technological risks and accumulated environmental strain, painting a picture of a future where humanity's own achievements may have become its undoing, and this uncertainty continued to haunt both researchers and the public alike. Yet in the midst of this darkness, there were also glimmers of hope emerging from the simulations, as certain alternative trajectories showed humanity successfully navigating these challenges, achieving technological advancement without destabilizing time, restoring planetary ecosystems, and fostering unprecedented global cooperation, resulting in stable futures extending far beyond Elara's era, demonstrating that while many paths led to collapse, others offered enduring survival and prosperity. These hopeful scenarios, though less probable under current trends, served as powerful motivation for change, illustrating that the future was not inherently doomed but highly sensitive to present actions, and that even small shifts in policy, culture, and technology could ripple forward to dramatically alter long-term outcomes. As I reflected on these findings, I often imagined Elara existing in one of those stable futures, growing up in a world where humanity had learned from its mistakes, where progress was balanced with wisdom, and where time itself remained intact. And while I knew that version of reality might be beyond our reach now, the possibility that other future generations could still thrive offered a sense of purpose amid the loss. The question that lingered, however, was whether humanity could collectively embrace the changes needed to move toward those stable paths before temporal instability advanced too far, or whether the inertia of existing systems and the allure of short-term gains would continue to push civilization along more dangerous trajectories. And in that tension lay the true significance of Ilara's disappearance, not just as a mystery of time travel, but as a mirror reflecting the consequences of humanity's choices across millennia. As the years unfolded and the world slowly adapted to the unsettling knowledge that the future was neither fixed nor guaranteed, the disappearance of Ilara transformed from a singular anomaly into a defining moment in humanity's understanding of time, a quiet turning point where certainty gave way to responsibility. And while many mysteries remained unresolved, one truth became increasingly clear, that the future was not something waiting passively to be reached, but something actively constructed through the collective momentum of human choices. Each decision adding weight to the delicate temporal structure that extended far beyond the present moment. The continued refinement of temporal resonance imaging and probability modeling gradually painted a more coherent picture of what had likely occurred around the year 3906, not as a single cataclysmic event but as a culmination of interconnected crises. Technological overreach compounded by environmental strain and systemic risk, creating a perfect storm that destabilized the temporal web in that region of the future. And although the precise trigger remained elusive, the convergence of evidence suggested that humanity's own advancements had played a central role, pushing the boundaries of what could be controlled until those boundaries finally gave way. In this light, Ilara's vanished timeline came to be understood not as an isolated tragedy, but as one branch among many that had succumbed to instability, a sobering reminder that progress without foresight could erase entire futures. And yet, paradoxically, this loss also illuminated the paths that remained open, showing that while some timelines had collapsed, others still stretched forward, offering humanity a chance, however fragile, to steer toward enduring stability. The global response to this realization was uneven yet undeniably transformative, as international coalitions formed to address long-term existential risks, creating frameworks for ethical technological development, environmental restoration, and conflict prevention that prioritize the well-being of future generations, alongside present needs. And though these efforts faced resistance and setbacks, they represented a significant shift in human consciousness, an acknowledgement that survival was not just about immediate prosperity, but about maintaining the continuity of time itself. Education systems began incorporating temporal responsibility into their curricula, teaching children not only history, but the far-reaching consequences of human actions across centuries, fostering a generation more attuned to long-term thinking, while scientific research increasingly emphasized risk assessment and ethical oversight, slowing the pace of certain high-stakes experiments while encouraging innovations aimed at sustainability and resilience. And although these changes did not instantly reshape humanity's trajectory, they marked the beginning of a cultural evolution toward greater collective foresight. For me, Ilara's absence remained both a wound and a guiding light, a constant reminder of what had been lost and what could still be preserved. And while I often mourned the future she would never experience, I also found solace in the knowledge that her story had sparked a broader awakening, motivating countless individuals to reflect on their role in shaping the world to come. And in that sense, her non-arrival had become a form of arrival after all, a presence felt through its profound impact rather than physical existence. In quieter moments, I returned to the temporal echoes captured by resonance imaging, those fleeting glimpses of advanced cities and restored ecosystems that once flourished in her timeline, not to dwell on what was gone, but to draw inspiration from what humanity had been capable of achieving before instability struck, seeing in those ghostly images a testament to human ingenuity and resilience, qualities that, if guided wisely, could still lead to stable and thriving futures. As debates about time, technology, and responsibility continued to evolve, one of the most significant philosophical shifts was the growing acceptance of uncertainty as an inherent aspect of existence, replacing the old belief in an inevitable march of progress with a more nuanced understanding that the future was a landscape of probabilities shaped by collective action. And while this uncertainty was unsettling, it also empowered humanity, emphasizing that no outcome was completely predetermined and that meaningful change remained possible. The mystery of Ilara's disappearance, though never fully solved in a conventional sense, ultimately served a deeper purpose by revealing the interconnectedness of past, present, and future in ways humanity had never before comprehended, transforming time from a passive backdrop into an active participant in human destiny, and in doing so, challenging civilization to rise to a new level of ethical maturity. Even now, as research continues, and new data occasionally sheds light on the shifting contours of the temporal web, the memory of that empty arrival platform remains etched in collective consciousness, a symbol of both loss and responsibility, reminding humanity that the absence of one child from a distant future represented the potential absence of countless generations if the lessons of temporal instability were ignored. Yet alongside this sobering awareness exists a quiet optimism rooted in the evidence of stable futures still accessible through careful choice and cooperation. Futures where humanity learns to balance innovation with wisdom, harnessing technology not as a force of unchecked disruption, but as a tool for sustainable growth and exploration, where environmental restoration becomes a central pillar of civilization, and where global collaboration replaces conflict as the primary driver of progress. In those possible tomorrows, children like Ilara are born into worlds shaped by foresight rather than short-sighted ambition, growing up in societies that understand the fragile beauty of time and the responsibility of preserving it. And while we may never know her face or hear her voice in our present reality, her story lives on as a catalyst for change, a reminder that every generation holds the power to either strengthen or weaken the bridge to those yet to come. Ultimately, the disappearance from the year 3906 taught humanity one of its most profound lessons, that the future is neither guaranteed nor distant, but intimately connected to the present moment, shaped by countless small choices as much as by monumental ones, and that safeguarding it requires not only technological brilliance but humility, cooperation, and an unwavering commitment to long-term well-being. As I look toward the horizon of possibility, I no longer see a single path stretching endlessly forward, but a vast branching network of potential realities, some leading to collapse, others to flourishing, all influenced by the actions of those living today. And while the uncertainty of this vision can be daunting, it also carries immense hope, because it means that the story of humanity is still being written, and that even in the face of lost futures, new ones can still be forged. The question that remains for each of us is not whether the future exists, but which future we are actively creating through our choices, whether we will continue along paths of unchecked progress and short-term gain, or embrace a more thoughtful and responsible approach to shaping civilization's destiny. And in that choice lies the true legacy of Ilara's disappearance, a call to awareness that echoes across time, urging humanity to become worthy stewards of both the present and the countless possible tomorrows that extend beyond it. And so, while the year 3906 may forever stand as a symbol of a future that slipped beyond reach, it also serves as a powerful reminder that the timeline ahead is still open, still malleable, still filled with potential, and that by learning from what has been lost, humanity may yet ensure that generations far beyond our own will not vanish into probability echoes, but will live, thrive, and carry the human story forward across centuries and stars.